The grand ballroom shimmered under the opulence of crystal chandeliers, their light catching every gleam and reflection as it cascaded over the room. It was an affair soaked in wealth, an annual charity gala, where the city's elite gathered, ostensibly for a noble cause. In truth, it was more of a contest, a spectacle of egos where fortunes were flaunted and champagne flowed like water. The pretense of altruism was thin, a mask everyone wore with the skill of actors at a play. I stood by the far wall, distancing myself from the center of the action, watching as the attendees flitted between tables, their laughter too crisp, their smiles too polished. The scene had a sheen of artificiality, a place where authenticity came to die beneath layers of designer gowns and practiced manners. I had seen this all before, the shallow conversations, the empty pledges of generosity, and the endless cycle of performative goodwill. This wasn't a gathering for change. It was a pageant of power, hidden under the pretense of charity. Scanning the crowd, I found myself searching for some form of genuine emotion in the faces around me. That's when I saw her. Caroline. She stood near the bar, her back turned toward me, casually engaged in conversation with an older couple. There was something different about her posture. It was relaxed but not indifferent. Her head tilted slightly, as if she was only half listening, her mind somewhere far from the discussion. The couple chuckled at something she said, but I doubted it was sincere laughter. For a moment, I couldn't look away. She seemed to sense it, for she turned her head slightly, catching my gaze across the room. Our eyes locked for the briefest of moments, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps curiosity. Whatever it was enough for her to politely excuse herself and begin walking toward me. Her movements were fluid, confident. Her emerald dress glistened under the ballroom's lights, but it was her eyes that captivated me, sharp, aware, carrying a depth that suggested she too was unimpressed with the charade surrounding us. "You don't seem to be enjoying yourself," she said with an amused smile when she reached me. I smiled back, appreciating her directness. "Am I that easy to read?" She raised a brow, glancing over her shoulder at the bustling crowd. "Well, you're the only one not pretending to have fun." I chuckled softly, acknowledging the truth in her words. Guilty as charged. These events, they're all the same. It's less about charity and more about who can outbid who for the biggest headline. Her eyes lit up in agreement. Exactly. It's like they're competing for who can feel the most self-righteous without ever getting their hands dirty. We shared a moment of silence, an odd sense of camaraderie forming between us. It was rare, in a room like this, to find someone who wasn't playing the game. She wasn't like the others. That much was clear. "So, why are you here?" I asked, genuinely curious. Caroline let out a soft sigh, her gaze drifting toward the chandelier above us. "My parents," she replied. "They're major supporters of this charity. It's expected of me to attend. But truthfully, I'd rather be doing something real. Raising awareness is great, but it feels like we're missing the point. Real change happens out there, not in ballrooms." I nodded, impressed by her candor. I couldn't agree more. But I think most people here are content to throw money at a problem and feel like they've done their part. A slow smile crept across her face. "And what about you? Why are you here if you don't believe in all this?" I glanced down at the glass in my hand, swirling the amber liquid inside. "Obligation, mostly. In our world, it's hard to avoid these kinds of events. Sometimes it's easier to show up and play the part." Her eyes softened as she studied me. "I get that. I've been surrounded by wealth my whole life, but the older I get, the more I realize how empty it can be. There's more to life than just this." She gestured to the extravagant room around us. In that moment, I felt a connection with her that went beyond mere attraction. It was as if we both saw through the illusions of our respective worlds, yearning for something real. Our conversation flowed effortlessly from there, covering everything from the vacuousness of the event to our shared desire for more meaningful pursuits. Just then, the lights dimmed, and the host of the evening took to the stage, signaling the start of the auction. Around us, the crowd turned eagerly toward the front, ready to display their generosity. Neither of us moved. "I suppose we should at least pretend to be interested," I said with a smirk. Caroline chuckled, the sound light and genuine. "I think just showing up counts as our contribution." She glanced toward an empty table at the far corner of the room. "Want to get out of the spotlight for a while?" I nodded, grateful for the offer. We made our way to the quieter corner, far from the fervor of the auction. As the auctioneer's voice droned on in the background, I found myself completely engrossed in our conversation. The more we talked, the more I realized that Caroline was different. Someone who saw beyond the glittering facades, someone who wanted to make a real difference in the world. At some point, I leaned in slightly, my voice softening. "I didn't expect to meet someone like you tonight." Her smile faltered for just a second, her eyes flickering with something unspoken. "Someone like me. Someone who gets it," I replied. "Someone who's not just here to play the game." For a long moment, she held my gaze, her expression thoughtful. "There's more to life than playing games, Leo," she said quietly. "The real challenge is finding people who understand that." And in that moment, I knew I had found someone who did. After that night at the charity event, Caroline and I began spending more time together. What had started as casual conversations over coffee and lunches turned into something deeper, something neither of us had quite expected. The connection we shared felt effortless, a rare harmony that existed without the usual complications that came with relationships in our world. Each time we met, I felt a sense of ease, as though I could shed the layers of pretense that I usually wore and simply be myself. One afternoon, we agreed to meet at a park on the outskirts of the city. A quiet place that Caroline had mentioned was one of her favorite retreats. She had grown up surrounded by opulence and expectation, yet it seemed she found solace in the simplicity of nature. When I arrived, I saw her sitting on a weathered bench, legs crossed, a book resting in her lap. The breeze played with her hair, and she looked up with a smile when she saw me approach. "You're early," she teased as I sat down beside her. I grinned, thought I'd try something new. "Impressed?" She laughed, a soft, musical sound that always seemed to lift the weight of the world off my shoulders. "Very impressed. But it's not your punctuality that I find impressive, Leo." I raised an eyebrow, curious. "Oh, then what is it?" Her gaze softened, and she turned slightly to face me. "It's the way you listen. Most people only hear what they want to hear, but you actually listen. It's rare, especially in the circles we come from." Her words caught me off guard. I wasn't used to people noticing that about me, let alone valuing it. In my world, listening was more of a tactical skill, something used to navigate negotiations and deals. But with Caroline, it was different. I wanted to hear everything she had to say. "I could say the same about you," I admitted. "You're not like anyone else I've met. Most people in our world are distracted by appearances, by what others think of them. But you see through all that." Caroline's gaze drifted to the trees around us, their leaves rustling gently in the wind. "Maybe it's because I've lived in that world my whole life. My parents, they're good people, but they're so focused on keeping up appearances that sometimes I wonder if they've forgotten what really matters." There was a note of sadness in her voice, a weight that seemed to have settled on her over the years. I could tell this wasn't something she discussed lightly, and I felt an urge to reach out to her, to tell her that I understood. "I get it," I said softly. "My parents were the same. Success, power, and wealth. That's all that mattered to them. I used to think that was all there was to life. But it doesn't make you happy, not really." Caroline turned to me then, her eyes searching mine. "What does make you happy, Leo?" It was such a simple question, but it struck me deeply. I hadn't thought about it in years. I had been so focused on building my career, amassing wealth, and securing my status that I had forgotten to ask myself that very thing. "I'm still figuring that out," I admitted. "But I think moments like this help." She smiled, and for a while, we just sat in comfortable silence, the world around us feeling distant and irrelevant. It was one of those rare moments when everything felt right, when all the pressures and expectations that came with our lives seemed to fade into the background. For once, it was just the two of us, sitting on a park bench, sharing an unspoken understanding. After a while, Caroline broke the silence. "You know, when we first met, I wasn't sure what to think of you." I glanced at her, amused. "Oh, what did you think?" She bit her lip, her eyes dancing with playful mischief. "I thought you were just another guy at one of those charity events, doing the bare minimum to look good for the cameras." I laughed, shaking my head. "Ouch. I'm glad I managed to prove you wrong." "You did," she said, her tone growing more serious. "But not in the way I expected. You're different, Leo. You care about things that actually matter. You're not just here for the show." Her words hit harder than I anticipated. It wasn't often that someone saw me like that, especially not someone like Caroline, who had every reason to be caught up in the same superficial world I had been raised in. "Caroline," I began, my voice softer, "I think that's why we work. We're both trying to find something real in a world that values all the wrong things." She nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving mine. "You're right, but it's hard, you know, especially with my parents." There it was, the topic we had both been avoiding. Caroline's parents, Elliot and Adeline, were wealthy, powerful, and deeply rooted in a world that prized status above all else. I hadn't met them yet, but from what Caroline had told me, I knew they would have high expectations for their daughter's future husband. And I wasn't sure if I measured up to those expectations. "Have you thought about telling them about us?" I asked gently. Caroline sighed, leaning back against the bench. "I've thought about it, but I know how they'll react. They'll want to know everything: your background, your family, how much money you make. And if you don't meet their standards—" Her voice trailed off, but the anxiety in her words was clear. I reached over and took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "I'm not worried about impressing your parents," I said quietly. "What matters is us. They'll come around when they see how much we care about each other." Caroline smiled, though it was tinged with uncertainty. "I hope you're right. But they're not like us, Leo. To them, everything is about money and status. I just want them to see you for who you really are." "Then we'll take it slow," I said, squeezing her hand gently. "We don't have to rush anything. I'm willing to wait until you're ready." She looked at me then, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Leo. That means a lot." The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm golden light over the park. We sat there for a while longer, hand in hand, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. Our connection was something real, something worth fighting for. And despite the uncertainties, I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to let anything come between us. The night I proposed to Caroline remains etched in my memory like a dream I never want to forget. It was one of those moments where everything seemed to fall into place, as if the universe itself had decided that, for just one night, the world would slow down and give us a moment of peace. I had spent weeks planning, perfecting every little detail. The setting, the timing, it all had to be just right. But more than anything, I wanted the proposal to reflect what we had built together: honesty, simplicity, and something far deeper than appearances. I chose the same restaurant where we had our first real date. It wasn't a high-profile venue, nor did it have the glitz and glamour that most of the places in our social circles boasted. It was a small, intimate restaurant by the river, with a candlelit patio overlooking the water. It was quiet and unpretentious, the kind of place where you could talk for hours without being interrupted. I knew Caroline loved it. She had once told me that it was one of the few places where she felt like she could escape the expectations of her family. The night was perfect. The air was crisp but not cold, and the soft glow of the city lights reflected off the river like 1,000 tiny stars. I arrived early, feeling a familiar mix of excitement and nerves, and waited for her on the patio, my hand brushing the small velvet box in my pocket as a reminder of what was to come. I had rehearsed my words countless times, but now that the moment was nearing, my thoughts were a blur. When Caroline arrived, she looked as radiant as ever. Her dark hair cascaded down her shoulders in soft waves, and she wore a simple dress that flowed with the evening breeze. There was something effortlessly graceful about her, something that never failed to take my breath away. "You look beautiful," I said, standing to greet her as she approached. "And you're as charming as ever," she replied with a grin, leaning in to kiss me on the cheek. "I have to admit, I was a little surprised when you told me we were coming here tonight. It feels like forever since we've been back." I guided her to our table, pulling out her chair. "I thought it was fitting," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's where everything started for us." Caroline's smile softened as she sat down, her eyes filled with warmth. "I remember that night. I didn't know what to expect, but you surprised me. In a good way." I smiled, though the weight of the ring box in my pocket made it hard to focus. "Well, I'm hoping to surprise you again tonight." The dinner was perfect, just as I had hoped. We talked, laughed, and reminisced about the early days of our relationship. We spoke about how we had managed to navigate the complexities of our worlds, how we had found a way to be ourselves despite the pressures from family, society, and everything in between. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and for most of the meal, Caroline seemed completely unaware of what I had planned. Beneath my calm exterior, however, my heart was racing. Finally, as the evening deepened and the soft hum of the city surrounded us, I knew it was time. I could feel my pulse quicken as I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small velvet box. Caroline was still talking, her face glowing in the candlelight, but when I cleared my throat, she stopped and looked at me, her brow furrowing slightly. "Caroline," I began, my voice lower than usual, "there's something I've been meaning to ask you for a while now." Her eyes widened slightly as I opened the box, revealing the ring inside. It was simple but elegant, a single diamond set in a platinum band. It wasn't flashy or ostentatious. It was timeless, just like her. Her hand instinctively went to her mouth, her eyes welling up with emotion. "Oh, Leo," she whispered, her voice trembling. I stood up from my chair, kneeling beside her as I held the ring. "Caroline," I said, my heart pounding in my chest, "from the moment we met, I knew you were someone special. You've challenged me, inspired me, and made me see the world in ways I never had before. You've shown me that love isn't about status or appearances. It's about trust, compassion, and shared values. You're the person I want to spend the rest of my life with. Will you marry me?" For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. She looked down at me, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and for a brief second, I thought she might be too overwhelmed to respond. But then she smiled, a smile so full of warmth and love that it made my chest tighten, and nodded. "Yes, Leo," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." Relief and joy washed over me in equal measure as I slipped the ring onto her finger, my hands shaking slightly. I stood up, pulling her into my arms as she hugged me tightly, her face buried against my shoulder. In that moment, nothing else mattered. The world outside, with all its complexities and expectations, faded into the background. It was just us, holding each other in the soft glow of the candlelight, our futures intertwined. As we sat back down, still holding hands, Caroline looked down at the ring on her finger, her smile full of disbelief and wonder. "I can't believe this is happening," she said softly. "I feel like I'm dreaming." I chuckled, brushing a tear from her cheek. "It's real," I said. "This is our reality now." She looked at me, her eyes full of love. "It's perfect. You're perfect." I shook my head, smiling at her. "Far from perfect," I said quietly, "but I promise I'll always try to be the man you deserve. That's my vow to you." Her fingers traced the ring, her expression softening. "You already are, Leo. You've always been." We spent the rest of the evening in a blissful daze, talking about the future, about the life we would build together. There was so much to plan, so many decisions to make, but none of it felt overwhelming. Instead, it felt like the start of something beautiful, something we would create side by side. But as the night wore on, I noticed a flicker of hesitation in Caroline's eyes, a shadow that hadn't been there before. I didn't press her, knowing that she would open up when she was ready, but I suspected it had something to do with her parents. We had spoken before about how they valued wealth and status above all else, and I knew she was nervous about how they would react to our engagement. Even though I was confident in our love, I couldn't shake the feeling that this would be a challenge we would have to face soon. As we walked along the river after dinner, Caroline's hand in mine, I could feel the weight of what was left unsaid between us. "Are you okay?" I asked gently. Caroline hesitated before nodding, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "I am. It's just my parents." I stopped walking, turning to face her. "Caroline, we'll deal with them together. It doesn't matter what they think. What matters is us." "I know," she said softly, looking down at the ring on her finger. I don't want them to ruin this for us." "They won't," I promised, taking both her hands in mine. "I'll meet them. I'll talk to them, and we'll figure it out. But nothing is going to come between us. I swear." She looked up at me, her eyes conflicted. "Leo, they're going to ask questions about your family, your background, your wealth. I've told them you're a good man, but they'll want more than that." "Let them ask," I said firmly. "We'll deal with it when the time comes." She nodded, though the worry lingered in her eyes. "I just hope they can see you the way I do." "They will," I assured her. "In time, they'll understand. But until then, let's just focus on us, okay?" Caroline smiled again, this time with more certainty. "Okay." As we walked back to the car, hand in hand, I knew that the challenges ahead wouldn't be easy. But with Caroline by my side, I felt ready to face whatever came our way. Our love was strong enough to weather any storm, and no matter what, I wasn't going to let anything or anyone come between us. The day I met Caroline's parents was a day I had been preparing for since the moment I proposed. Elliot and Adeline Montgomery were known for their wealth, influence, and deeply ingrained social expectations. Everything about their lives revolved around status, and I knew they would expect the same from the man who would marry their daughter. Caroline had warned me about their high standards, their tendency to judge a person's worth by their bank account rather than their character. But we both agreed on one thing. We didn't want their approval to be based on money. If they were going to accept me, it had to be because of who I was, not what I had. That's why we made a decision, a risky one, but one we both believed in. I would hide my wealth from them, at least for now. I wanted them to see me as a man of values, a man who loved their daughter not for her connections or her family's fortune, but for who she was. It wasn't going to be easy, but it felt like the right thing to do. If they couldn't accept me at my most modest, then they didn't deserve to know the rest. That morning, as I stood in front of the mirror, I barely recognized myself. Gone was the tailored suit and designer watch, the polished shoes and crisp shirt that I usually wore to such occasions. Instead, I was dressed in a simple plaid shirt, worn jeans, and boots that looked like they had seen better days. I was determined to blend into the background, to come across as an ordinary guy with no extraordinary means. It felt strange, being out of my usual skin, but necessary. If I wanted them to see the real me, I had to strip away the trappings of wealth. Caroline entered the room, her gaze sweeping over me with a mix of amusement and concern. "Are you sure you want to do this?" she asked, biting her lip. We could still tell them the truth. "It's not too late." I smiled, adjusting the collar of my shirt. "I'm sure. Didn't you say you wanted them to see the real me?" She sighed, stepping closer to fix my collar. "Yes, but I don't know if this is the real you. You don't have to downplay who you are." "I'm not," I replied, leaning in to kiss her on the forehead. This is just a part of me. The part that isn't tied to how much I make or what I wear. I want them to get to know that side of me first. If they can't accept that, then it doesn't matter how much money I have. Caroline looked at me, her eyes filled with love, but also worry. I just don't want them to look down on you. I shook my head, placing my hands on her shoulders. I don't care what they think. What matters is what you think. She smiled softly, though I could still see the tension in her shoulders. Just be prepared. My father can be intimidating. I smirked, trying to lighten the mood. How bad can he be? I've faced worse. But Caroline didn't laugh. Her silence only heightened my curiosity about the man I was about to meet. I pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. I was ready to prove myself to her parents, not through wealth or status, but through the person I truly was. We arrived at the Montgomery estate later that afternoon, and the moment I laid eyes on the mansion, I understood exactly why Caroline had been so nervous. The place was immense, almost intimidating in its grandeur. Marble columns lined the front, and the circular driveway was flanked by manicured gardens that stretched on for what seemed like miles. A fountain stood proudly in the center of the driveway, water spraying from its centerpiece with an elegance that felt almost excessive. Everything about the estate screamed opulence, and for a brief moment I felt out of place. Caroline squeezed my hand as we walked toward the entrance, sensing my unease. "Remember, I'm with you," she whispered. I gave her a reassuring smile, though my heart was pounding. "Let's do this." A butler dressed in a sharp black suit opened the door and led us inside. The interior of the mansion was just as extravagant as the exterior. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceilings, and every corner of the room seemed to gleam with gold accents and polished wood. It was the kind of place where you could feel the weight of wealth pressing down on you, a constant reminder of where you stood in the social hierarchy. Elliot Montgomery was already waiting for us in the sitting room. He stood as we entered, his gaze sharp and assessing. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with graying hair slicked back in a way that added to his air of authority. His tailored suit looked expensive, perfectly cut to his frame, and when he extended his hand to me, I could feel the strength in his grip. He wasn't the type of man who liked to be challenged. "Ah, Caroline," he said warmly, greeting her with a kiss on the cheek. But when he turned to me, his smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of mild curiosity and skepticism. "And this must be Leo." "Yes, sir," I said, shaking his hand firmly. "It's a pleasure to meet you." He didn't respond right away, his gaze flicking over my clothes with a subtle but unmistakable judgment. "I see Caroline has told you a little about us." "She has," I replied evenly. "I've heard a lot about you, Mr. Montgomery. And yet I've heard very little about you," he said, his tone smooth but carrying an edge. He glanced briefly at Caroline before returning his attention to me. "But I suppose we'll have plenty of time to change that." I could already feel the tension mounting, but I kept my posture relaxed. I wasn't here to play games or prove myself in the way Elliot expected. If he was going to judge me, it wouldn't be on his terms. Adeline, Caroline's mother, entered the room moments later. She was every bit as elegant as her husband, dressed in a designer gown that shimmered in the afternoon light. Her smile was warm but distant, the kind of smile you give when you're trying to be polite, while making a mental checklist of everything wrong with the situation. She greeted Caroline with genuine affection, but regarded me with a kind of detached curiosity, as though trying to figure out if I was worthy of being in her home. We moved to the dining room for lunch, and as we sat down at the long, elaborately set table, I could feel Elliot's eyes on me, sizing me up. The meal was a display of wealth in itself, exotic dishes laid out with precision, each one more extravagant than the last. It was the kind of food meant to impress, not necessarily to enjoy. "So, Leo," Elliot began, his voice cutting through the room, "what is it that you do for a living?" Here it was, the first test. I took a breath, keeping my tone neutral. "I manage a small business. A small business. Elliot raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. And what kind of business might that be? Various investments, I replied calmly. Mostly in renewable energy and ethical startups. It's something I'm passionate about. Elliot leaned back in his chair, swirling the wine in his glass as he studied me. Interesting. It's not often that one finds a man with such modest means investing in such ventures. I met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. I believe in living a life that reflects my values, Mr. Montgomery. Wealth isn't everything. He smirked, clearly amused by my answer, though there was something calculating in his expression. Perhaps not, but it certainly makes life easier, wouldn't you agree? I held his gaze, my voice steady. Comfortable, yes, but true happiness comes from something else. There was a brief silence, and I could feel the tension growing in the room. Elliot wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he considered beneath him. But before he could respond, Adeline chimed in. "Tell me, Leo," she said smoothly, her eyes glinting with interest. "What are your thoughts on luxury? Surely a man of your background must have some unique perspective." I smiled politely, knowing where this was going. Luxury can be nice, but it doesn't define who I am. I think real value comes from how we treat others and the impact we leave behind. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and I could feel Elliot watching me, waiting for me to slip up. But I held my ground, refusing to play their game. The real test came when Elliot offered me a particularly rare dish, one I immediately recognized as being made from an endangered species. He pushed the plate toward me, his eyes gleaming with challenge. "Try this," he said, his tone casual. "It's a delicacy, not something you find every day." I looked at the plate for a long moment, feeling the weight of Caroline's gaze on me. This was a test, one meant to see if I would conform to their world or stand by my principles. "Thank you," I said, pushing the plate back gently. "But I'll have to pass. I don't support the consumption of endangered species." Elliot's eyes darkened, but he maintained his composed demeanor. Not many would refuse such an offering. I met his gaze steadily. "Some things are more important than appearances, Mr. Montgomery." The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. But I didn't back down. I wasn't here to impress them with wealth or status. I was here to be myself, and if that wasn't enough for them, then so be it. The Montgomery estate was like a fortress, not just in its imposing architecture, but in the way it concealed the truth. On the surface, everything appeared flawless, elegant, luxurious, and meticulously curated. But beneath that gleaming exterior, I sensed something darker. The more time I spent at the estate, the more I realized that not everything was as it seemed. Small details began to nag at me, conversations that cut off abruptly when I entered the room, secretive phone calls between Elliot and people I had never met, and rooms that were always locked, even though the rest of the mansion was freely accessible. Something was being hidden behind these walls. The unease began to creep in slowly, like a shadow lurking just out of sight. Caroline didn't seem to notice, or perhaps she was too used to it to care. After all, she had grown up here, surrounded by wealth and secrets, conditioned to accept them as part of life. But I couldn't let it go. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this family than they were letting on, and the more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that they were hiding something big. It wasn't long before I decided to investigate on my own. I wasn't looking for trouble, but I knew that whatever they were keeping hidden, it had to be important. One evening, after a tense dinner where Elliot had once again tested my patience with his subtle jabs, I found myself wandering through the house. Caroline had gone to bed early, tired from a long day of meetings, and I had pretended to do the same. But instead, I found myself drawn to the parts of the estate that were always off-limits, the locked doors, the rooms no one ever entered. As I walked through the halls, the house was eerily quiet. The only sound was the soft click of my footsteps against the marble floors. I passed several closed doors, most of them likely guest rooms or unused spaces. But when I reached the far end of the hallway, I noticed something different. One of the doors that was always locked was slightly ajar. My pulse quickened, and I hesitated for a moment, glancing around to make sure I was alone. Pushing the door open slowly, I stepped inside. The room was dark, the faint glow from the hallway casting long shadows across the floor. It looked like an office, though it hadn't been used in some time. Dust covered the surfaces, and the air smelled stale, as if the room had been sealed off for years. An old oak desk sat in the center, papers scattered haphazardly across it, and shelves lined the walls, filled with books and ledgers that looked far too worn for a family as wealthy as the Montgomerys. My eyes fell on a photograph that was partially hidden beneath a pile of papers on the desk. I pulled it out and held it up to the light. It was an old black and white photo of a much younger Elliot and Adeline, standing in front of what appeared to be a factory. But what caught my attention wasn't them. It was the man standing between them. He was younger than Elliot, but older than Adeline, his arm slung casually around her waist. His face was familiar, but I couldn't place him. Just as I was about to examine the photograph more closely, I heard a noise behind me, a soft shuffle of footsteps. My heart leaked into my throat as I spun around, only to see Caroline standing in the doorway, her expression a mixture of surprise and concern. "Leo," she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "What are you doing in here?" I hesitated, my mind racing for an explanation. "The door was open," I said finally. "I didn't mean to pry, but I found this." I held up the photograph, watching as Caroline's eyes flicked to it. For a brief second, her face paled, and she looked almost afraid. "That's nothing," she said quickly, crossing the room and taking the photo from my hand. "This room hasn't been used in years. My father is very private about some things." I frowned, sensing her discomfort. "Who's the man in the photo?" She glanced down at the image, her grip tightening on the edges of the photograph. "He's someone from their past. It's complicated. Leo, please, just trust me. There are things about my family that I can't explain right now." I stepped closer, my concern deepening. "Caroline, if something's wrong, you can tell me. I want to help." She shook her head, her eyes pleading with me to let it go. "There's nothing wrong. Just, please, don't bring this up again." There was a long moment of silence between us, the tension in the air almost unbearable. I wanted to push her for more answers, but the look in her eyes stopped me. Whatever this secret was, it had a hold on her, and she wasn't ready to confront it. Not yet. "Okay," I said softly, backing off. "I'll drop it. But if there's something you're not telling me, I hope you know you can trust me." She nodded, though the worry never left her expression. "I do. But some things are better left alone." With that, she turned and left the room, leaving me standing there with more questions than answers. I knew then that this secret, whatever it was, ran deeper than I had imagined. It wasn't just a family secret. It was something that had the power to unravel everything. And though Caroline had asked me to let it go, I knew I couldn't. Not completely. The next day, I found myself alone at the estate again. Caroline had gone to visit a friend, and her parents were out of town. I told myself I wasn't going to investigate any further, that I would respect Caroline's wishes, but the nagging feeling in the back of my mind refused to go away. I couldn't shake the image of that photograph, the way Caroline had reacted when she saw it. There was something about that man, something important. I wandered the halls aimlessly for a while, trying to clear my head, but eventually I found myself back in that office. The door was still ajar, just as it had been the night before. This time, I didn't hesitate. Stepping inside, I made my way to the desk. The photograph was gone, likely taken by Caroline, but the papers were still scattered across the surface. I began sifting through them, careful not to disturb anything too much. Most of the documents were mundane, old business records, ledgers, and correspondence. But then, something caught my eye. Tucked underneath a stack of papers was an envelope, yellowed with age. It had no markings on the front, but inside was a letter. As I unfolded the letter, my eyes skimmed the contents, and my blood ran cold. It was a contract signed by Elliot Montgomery and the man from the photograph. The terms were vague, but the implications were clear. The factory in the background of the photo wasn't just any factory. It was part of some kind of shady operation, something that Elliot had been involved in long before he became the respectable philanthropist everyone knew him as today. And the man in the photo. He was a partner, a silent figure in Elliot's past, now buried and forgotten. I folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope, my mind racing. I didn't know exactly what this meant, but I knew it wasn't good. Whatever Elliot had been involved in, it was big, and it wasn't over. Caroline had no idea. And now, I was certain that I couldn't ignore this any longer. As I left the office, a sinking feeling settled in my gut. I had stumbled onto something that could change everything, not just for me, but for Caroline. Her family's pristine image was a lie, and I was holding the pieces that could tear it apart. The question was, what was I going to do about it? I couldn't let it go. No matter how hard I tried to push the doubts aside, the image of that contract kept flashing in my mind like a neon sign. Whatever was hidden in Elliot Montgomery's past wasn't just some family skeleton that could be swept under the rug. It was something dangerous, something big enough to threaten everything. Caroline had asked me to drop it, but how could I? She had no idea what her family was involved in. And the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that this wasn't just a remnant of the past. Whatever Elliot had buried, it was still alive, lurking in the shadows. I needed answers, but I couldn't ask Caroline for them. Not yet. She was too close to this, too wrapped up in her love for her family. She wouldn't believe me if I told her outright, and I didn't want to drag her into something that could hurt her without concrete proof. If I was going to uncover the truth, I had to do it on my own. The following morning, I decided to dig deeper. The contract I had found was just the tip of the iceberg, and I was certain there were more clues to be found. I started by looking into the factory from the photograph, the one where Elliot and his mysterious partner had posed, the site of their agreement. A quick search turned up little information at first. The factory had closed down years ago, its name lost in the annals of forgotten businesses. But after some digging, I managed to trace it back to a company Elliot had briefly owned in the late 1990s, a company involved in textiles, or so the public records claimed. Something about that didn't sit right with me. A man like Elliot, with his background in finance and high society, wouldn't dabble in something as mundane as textiles without a bigger reason. I scrolled through news archives, trying to find any mention of the company or its shutdown. That's when I stumbled across a series of articles about environmental violations, illegal dumping, and unexplained factory fires in the region where Elliot's business had been located. The articles were vague, never directly naming Elliot's company, but they were from the same period and mentioned a series of investigations that had mysteriously been dropped. There was no smoking gun, but I could sense I was getting closer to the truth. Whatever Elliot had been involved in back then, it hadn't been legal, and I had a feeling his business dealings weren't just about textiles. There was something darker at play, something he had worked very hard to cover up. But the more I uncovered, the more dangerous this started to feel. I needed help. Someone who knew more about Elliot's history and his connections. Someone who had seen his rise to power firsthand. That's when I remembered the orphanage. Caroline had mentioned it several times during our conversations. The Maplewood Children's Home was a charity her parents had supported for years, one of the causes they were most proud of. It was also the perfect cover for someone who wanted to appear generous while hiding less savory activities. If Elliot had been funneling money or engaging in shady deals, it would be the kind of place where secrets might slip through the cracks. I decided to pay the orphanage a visit. The building was older than I had imagined. Faded paint peeled from the walls, and the front lawn was overgrown with weeds, a far cry from the glossy brochures and charity galas that Elliot and Adeline hosted in its name. Inside, the halls were quiet, and the air smelled of mildew and old books. I was greeted by a woman in her 40s named Laura, who seemed to be one of the few staff members left. "Welcome to Maplewood," she said, smiling, though there was a tiredness in her eyes. "How can I help you?" "I'm Leo," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. "I've heard a lot about the orphanage from Caroline Montgomery. I was wondering if I could learn more about how things run here, especially how donations are used." Laura's smile faltered slightly, and she glanced around the empty hallway, as if checking for prying ears. "Well, we do the best we can with what we have. But things have been tough lately," she admitted, lowering her voice. "Donations have been down, and we've had to cut some programs." I leaned in, sensing an opportunity. "I thought the Montgomery family was one of your largest supporters." Laura nodded, her eyes widening. "They are. Or at least they were. But recently, well, I'm not supposed to say too much." I met her gaze, keeping my tone gentle. "Laura, if there's something going on here, something that's not right, I want to help. But I need to know the truth." She hesitated for a moment, chewing on her bottom lip as she considered whether to trust me. Finally, she sighed. "There've been rumors. Whispers, really. Some of the funds, they've gone missing. We're told it's for administrative costs, but there's no record of where the money is going. And sometimes, large sums will show up for projects that never seem to materialize. But I don't have any proof." My pulse quickened. "Missing money? How long has this been going on?" Laura shook her head, glancing around nervously. "Years, I think. It's hard to say. We're just grateful for the donations, but it's frustrating. I've tried asking questions, but they always tell me the Montgomerys know what they're doing, that it's all going to the right places. But I don't know. Have you seen any unusual activity? Anything that might suggest where the money is actually going?" Laura looked down at her hands, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. "I'm not sure, but if you really want to know, there's a meeting coming up with the board to discuss funding. If you can get in, maybe you'll find what you're looking for." I thanked Laura and promised to keep her name out of it. As I left the orphanage, my mind raced with possibilities. Missing money, secret projects, and no accountability. It all pointed to one thing. Elliot was using the orphanage as a front, possibly to launder money or divert funds into illegal ventures. But what kind of ventures, and how deeply was he involved? I didn't know for sure, but I had a lead. I had to attend that board meeting, even if it meant getting creative to find a way in. I was on the cusp of something big, something that could expose everything Elliot had worked to hide. But the more I uncovered, the more I realized that I was walking a dangerous line. If Elliot discovered what I was doing, there was no telling what he might do to protect his secrets. The next few days were a blur of preparation. I knew I couldn't confront Elliot without solid proof, and I wasn't about to drag Caroline into this without knowing exactly what her family was involved in. But I also knew that time was running out. The board meeting was my best chance to uncover the full extent of Elliot's operations, and I couldn't afford to miss it. On the morning of the meeting, I arrived early, slipping into the building through a side entrance I had scouted out the day before. The room where the meeting was being held was small, with a few members of the orphanage's board seated around a long table. I kept to the shadows, listening carefully as they discussed budgets, donations, and upcoming projects. But then, something caught my attention. One of the board members mentioned a special project that had been funded by an anonymous donor. The project was vague. No specifics were given, but the amount of money involved was staggering, and when they showed the breakdown of the orphanage's finances, the numbers didn't add up. Money was disappearing, just as Laura had said, and it was being funneled into something much bigger than anyone in that room realized. My heart pounded as I jotted down notes, piecing together the puzzle. This was it. This was the connection I had been looking for. Elliot wasn't just hiding a dark past. He was actively involved in something illegal, something that stretched far beyond the orphanage. And I was the only one who could expose him. As I slipped out of the building, my mind raced with the implications of what I had discovered. Elliot Montgomery wasn't the man he pretended to be, and his web of lies was about to unravel. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just scratched the surface. The real truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered, and I was going to find it. The weight of the truth pressed down on me as I drove to the Montgomery estate. I had spent the past few days piecing everything together. The missing money, the shady business deals, and the orphanage being used as a front. Every step of the investigation pointed to the same conclusion. Elliot Montgomery was involved in something far more sinister than I had initially imagined. His pristine reputation, the charitable facade he and Adeline presented to the world, was nothing more than a mask for illegal operations that stretched back years. And now, I had the proof. But there was a cost to all of this. The closer I got to the truth, the more I realized that exposing Elliot would destroy everything Caroline believed about her family. She loved them, despite their flaws, despite their obsession with wealth and status. How could I tell her that the people she trusted most had built their empire on lies? I had no choice but to tell her, but I knew it would break her heart. The sun was setting as I pulled into the driveway of the estate, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. The mansion loomed ahead, its elegant facade betraying none of the corruption festering inside. I took a deep breath, gripping the steering wheel as if bracing for impact. This wasn't going to be easy. I had to confront Elliot and Adeline first, tell them what I knew, give them a chance to explain themselves, and then prepare for the fallout. I entered the house through the front door, my footsteps echoing in the vast entry hall. A butler nodded politely and informed me that Elliot was in his study. I thanked him, though my heart was pounding in my chest. With each step toward the study, my mind raced through possible outcomes. Confrontation, denial, threats. None of it mattered anymore. I had gone too far to turn back. I knocked on the door of the study, and after a moment, Elliot's voice called for me to enter. Pushing the door open, I found him sitting at his large mahogany desk, surrounded by papers. He looked up, surprised to see me. "Leo," he said, his voice measured. "I wasn't expecting you. Is everything all right?" I closed the door behind me, my heart still hammering in my chest. "We need to talk." Elliot leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What about?" I stepped closer to the desk, my voice low but firm. "I know what you've been doing, Elliot. I know about the missing money, the fake donations, and the illegal business dealings. I know about the orphanage being used as a front, and I have proof." For a moment, there was only silence between us. Elliot's expression didn't change, but I could see a flicker of something dark in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps even fear. But then he leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk as he studied me. "Those are very serious accusations, Leo," he said calmly. "Do you have any idea what you're saying?" "I know exactly what I'm saying," I replied, refusing to back down. "I've seen the financial records. I've spoken to people at the orphanage. I've uncovered your business dealings. You've been laundering money through that charity, funneling it into your illegal operations, and using your status to cover it all up." Elliot's jaw tightened, but his voice remained cold. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." "Oh, I think I do," I said, stepping closer. "You've been hiding behind your reputation for years, using your wealth to protect yourself while you exploit vulnerable people. You may have fooled everyone else, but you haven't fooled me." Elliot stood up abruptly, his towering frame casting a shadow across the room. "You think you can come in here, into my home, and accuse me of such things? You have no proof. You're grasping at straws, and you're going to ruin yourself in the process." I met his gaze, unflinching. "I have everything I need to expose you. The documents, the contracts, the financial records. enough to bring you down. You can deny it all you want, but I'm not going to let you drag Caroline down with you." At the mention of his daughter, Elliot's face darkened. He stepped around the desk, closing the distance between us. "Caroline has nothing to do with this." "She has everything to do with this," I shot back. "She's your daughter, and she deserves to know the truth. She deserves to know what kind of man her father really is." Just then, the door to the study creaked open, and Adeline stepped inside, her face a mask of confusion and concern. "What's going on in here?" she asked, her eyes flicking between Elliot and me. "Leo seems to think he's uncovered some grand conspiracy," Elliot said, his voice dripping with disdain. "He's accusing us of crimes, Adeline. He's threatening to destroy everything we've built." Adeline's face paled, and she turned to me, her voice soft but pleading. "Leo, this isn't true, is it? Whatever you think you found, you must be mistaken. Elliot is a good man. We've done nothing wrong." I looked at her, my heart sinking. She had no idea. All these years, she had stood by her husband's side, believing in the image he had crafted for the world. But now that image was crumbling, and I was the one who had to shatter it completely. "I wish I was wrong, Adeline," I said quietly. "But I'm not. Elliot has been involved in illegal activities for years. The money from the orphanage, it's been going into shady deals, covering up crimes, and funding things that have nothing to do with charity." Adeline shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "No, this can't be true. Elliot, tell him he's wrong. Tell him." Elliot didn't respond immediately. His face was stone, his jaw clenched tight as he stared at me with a mix of fury and calculation. Finally, he spoke, his voice cold and unyielding. "Get out," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "You've crossed a line, Leo. You don't know who you're dealing with. Leave now before you regret it." I stood my ground. "I'm not leaving until you admit what you've done." Elliot's expression hardened, and for a moment, I thought he might physically throw me out. But then, before he could make a move, another voice rang out from the doorway. "What's going on?" Caroline. She stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. She must have heard the raised voices and come to investigate. Now she was faced with the scene she never could have expected. Her father standing inches away from me, his face twisted with anger, her mother on the verge of tears. "Caroline," I began, my voice softening, "there's something I need to tell you." Her gaze flickered between us, her voice trembling. "What is this? What's happening?" Elliot stepped back, his expression shifting to one of practiced calm. "It's nothing, darling. Leo's just confused. He thinks. I think your father's been hiding things from you." I interrupted, my eyes locking with Caroline's. "I think you deserve to know the truth." She looked at me, her eyes pleading for an explanation, for something that made sense in the chaos that had erupted. "What truth?" I took a deep breath, knowing that this would change everything. "Your father's been involved in illegal activities for years. Money laundering, shady business deals, using the orphanage as a front. I found the proof, Caroline. I didn't want to believe it, but it's true." Her face drained of color, and she took a step back, shaking her head. No, that can't be. My father, he's always supported good causes. He's always been." "Caroline, listen to me," I said, stepping toward her. "I didn't want to hurt you, but I had to find out the truth. Your father has been hiding this for years, and I can prove it. You have to believe me." Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at me, then at her parents. "Is this true?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence in the room was suffocating. Finally, Elliot sighed, his shoulders sagging as the weight of the truth bore down on him. "Caroline," he began, his voice low, "it's complicated." She gasped, stepping back as if she had been struck. "Complicated? You've been lying to me. All these years. Everything I've done for this family," Elliot said, his tone growing defensive. "You don't understand the world I've had to navigate. The sacrifices I've made. It wasn't supposed to come to this." Caroline's tears flowed freely now, and I wanted nothing more than to hold her, to protect her from the pain of what was unfolding. But I knew this was something she had to face on her own. "You lied to me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Everything. It's all been a lie." Adeline moved to comfort her, but Caroline pulled away, her face crumpling with grief. I can't believe this." I took a step forward, my heart aching for her. "Caroline, I'm so sorry." She looked at me then, her eyes filled with sorrow and betrayal. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't know for sure," I said softly. "I didn't want to hurt you unless I knew the truth." "And now you do," she said bitterly. I nodded, feeling the weight of my actions crushing me. "Now I do." Caroline turned away from all of us, her body trembling with sobs. I reached out to her, but she pulled away, her voice cracking as she whispered, "I need to be alone." With that, she fled from the room, leaving me standing there with Elliot and Adeline, the enormity of what had just happened crashing down around us. I had exposed the truth, but in doing so, I had shattered everything. The silence that followed Caroline's exit hung in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating and oppressive. Elliot stood by his desk, his face a mixture of anger and something that looked like regret, while Adeline collapsed into a nearby chair, her eyes red and swollen with tears. I remained rooted to the spot, unsure of what to do next. The truth was out, and it had torn through the Montgomery family like a hurricane, leaving devastation in its wake. For a moment, none of us spoke. The weight of everything that had just happened was too much to process. I kept replaying Caroline's face in my mind. The shock, the hurt, the sense of betrayal that had flashed in her eyes when I told her what her father had done. I had prepared myself for the fallout, but nothing could have truly readied me for the pain I had seen on her face. Elliot was the first to break the silence, his voice low and filled with a dangerous calm. "You've destroyed everything, Leo." I turned to face him, my jaw tightening. "No, Elliot. You destroyed everything the moment you started hiding the truth. You don't understand the kind of world I've had to navigate," he snapped, his voice growing louder with every word. "I did what I had to do. Everything I've built, everything we have, is because I was willing to make sacrifices, to play the game the way it's meant to be played." I shook my head, disgust rising in my throat. "Sacrifices? You're talking about lies, deception, and corruption. You laundered money, funded illegal ventures, and used innocent people as pawns. That's not sacrifice, that's greed." Elliot's face hardened, his eyes narrowing as he took a step toward me. "You have no idea what it takes to survive in this world, Leo. You've been playing at being the moral hero, but you have no clue how ruthless this life is. I've kept this family together. I've kept us safe, and if I have to make some hard choices along the way, then so be it." "At what cost?" I shot back, my voice rising. "Your family doesn't even know who you are anymore. Caroline, she trusted you, and now she's left questioning everything you've ever told her." Elliot's jaw clenched, and for a moment I thought he might lash out. But then his gaze softened just slightly, and he turned away from me, pacing toward the window. "You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to lie to my daughter? I've done what I could to protect her from the ugliness of the world. I've done everything I could to make sure she didn't have to see the darker side of what we do. But now she's seen it," I said quietly, "and there's no going back." Adeline, who had been silent until now, spoke up, her voice shaky. We never meant for any of this to happen. We just wanted what was best for Caroline. We wanted her to have the life she deserved." I looked at her, trying to muster some empathy despite everything that had happened. "Do you really think this is what's best for her? A life built on lies. A family that can't even be honest with each other?" Adeline's shoulders sagged as tears welled in her eyes again. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know anymore. The room fell into silence once more, the enormity of the situation weighing down on all of us. I glanced toward the door, wondering where Caroline had gone, my heart aching to go after her, to comfort her. But I knew that I couldn't fix this, not with words, not right now. She needed time, space to process the truth. Finally, I spoke again, my voice steady but filled with a determination I hadn't felt before. You need to come clean, Elliot. All of it. Not just to Caroline, but to the authorities. You can't keep running from this. Elliot turned from the window, his face pale. You don't know what you're asking. I'm asking you to do the right thing, I replied, standing firm. For once in your life, stop hiding. Take responsibility for what you've done. It's the only way you'll ever have a chance at redemption. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the battle raging inside him. Pride and fear, guilt and defiance all warring for control. But then, just as I thought he might relent, his expression hardened once more. No, he said firmly, shaking his head. I can't do that. I won't. Elliot, please, Adeline whispered, reaching for him, but he pulled away, his gaze steely. I've come too far to throw it all away now, he said, his voice cold and resolute. You don't understand what's at stake. This isn't just about me. There are people involved who, they wouldn't let this go. If I go down, so does everyone else. And trust me, Leo, you don't want to get in the way of that. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the extent of the danger I was facing. This wasn't just about Elliot's misdeeds. There were others involved, powerful people who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. I had stumbled into something much bigger than I had anticipated, and I wasn't sure how deep the rot went. But I couldn't back down now. Not when the truth was on the line. I'm not afraid of you, Elliot, I said, my voice steady. And I'm not afraid of the people you're protecting. If you won't come clean, I will. I'll go to the authorities myself. I'll make sure they know everything I've uncovered. You can't silence me. Elliot's eyes flashed with fury, but before he could respond, a new voice cut through the tension like a knife. You won't have to. We all turned toward the doorway to see Caroline standing there, her face pale but determined. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was a fierceness in her expression that I hadn't seen before. She stepped into the room, her gaze fixed on her father. I'll go to the authorities, she said quietly, her voice shaking with emotion. I'll tell them everything. Elliot took a step toward her, his voice softening. Caroline, please. You don't understand what you're doing. You'll ruin everything. No, Dad, she said, her voice breaking. You already did. The silence that followed her words was deafening. Elliot stood frozen, his face a mask of anguish as he stared at his daughter, the weight of his actions finally crashing down on him. Adeline reached for Caroline, but she stepped back, shaking her head. I thought I knew you, Caroline whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I thought our family was something good, but it was all a lie. I can't be a part of this anymore. Elliot's face crumpled, but there was nothing he could say to make this right. The truth was out, and the damage was done. I'll fix this, Caroline said, turning to me, her eyes filled with sorrow. I'll do what's right, but I can't stay here anymore. Caroline, I began, reaching for her, but she shook her head. I need to go, Leo, she whispered, her voice breaking. I need to figure out who I am, without all of this. I watched helplessly as she turned and walked out of the room, leaving me, Elliot, and Adeline in the wreckage of what had once been their perfect life. I wanted to chase after her, to tell her that we could face this together, but I knew deep down that she needed to do this on her own. She needed space to rebuild herself from the pieces of the life she had lost. As she disappeared down the hallway, I stood there in silence, my heart heavy with regret. I had done what I had set out to do. I had exposed the truth, but in doing so, I had lost the person I cared about most. And now, All I could do was hope that someday, when the dust had settled, Caroline would find her way back to me. The days that followed felt like a blur. I hadn't spoken to Caroline since that night. She had left the estate, and from what I could gather, she wasn't planning to return anytime soon. Elliot and Adeline had tried to reach out to her, but their calls had gone unanswered. I didn't blame her. Everything she had believed in, everything she had grown up with, had crumbled around her. How do you come back from something like that? How do you face a life built on lies? I, too, found myself grappling with the fallout. The truth was out, but it felt hollow. Exposing Elliot had come at the cost of losing Caroline, and I couldn't help but wonder if it had been worth it. I had spent so much time fighting for what I believed was right, but now, standing in the wreckage, it felt like I had won a battle but lost everything else. Despite the ache in my chest, I knew I had to finish what I started. The authorities needed to be involved, and Caroline had made it clear that she would do the right thing. But that didn't mean I could just stand by and watch from the sidelines. The corruption in Elliot's world ran deeper than I had imagined, and if powerful people were protecting him, as he had suggested, then this fight wasn't over. I had only scratched the surface of the darkness that lay beneath. One morning, after days of restless nights and endless thoughts of Caroline, I decided to take action. I went straight to the authorities, armed with the documents I had gathered. The contracts, the financial records, and the information I had uncovered about the orphanage. I presented everything. The investigation would be long and arduous, but I knew I had enough evidence to start pulling the threads that would unravel Elliot's entire operation. It didn't take long for the authorities to act. A team of investigators descended on the Montgomery estate, and it wasn't long before the news broke. Elliot Montgomery, once hailed as a pillar of the community, was under investigation for money laundering, embezzlement, and a host of other white-collar crimes. The headlines splashed across the front pages of newspapers and filled the airwaves. His carefully curated image as a benevolent philanthropist was shattered in an instant. The public was in shock. For years, the Montgomery family had been the picture of wealth, elegance, and generosity. Now that image was tainted by scandal, and the whispers about Elliot's shady business dealings grew louder with every passing day. There was no hiding anymore, no more polished appearances to protect him. The world finally saw him for who he really was. As the investigation deepened, more names began to surface. Elliot had been right about one thing: he wasn't alone. The people he had been involved with, those who had helped him hide his crimes, were powerful and dangerous. Some of them had already fled, while others were preparing to fight. The corruption wasn't limited to Elliot's businesses. It extended to politicians, investors, and even law enforcement. The more they dug, the more they uncovered. In the midst of it all, I felt a strange sense of emptiness. I had set out to do what was right, to expose the truth, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like the price had been too high. I had lost Caroline, the one person who mattered most to me, and even though I knew she needed time to heal, I couldn't shake the fear that she would never forgive me, never see me the same way again. I hadn't heard from her since that night, and every day that passed without a word from her felt like a deeper cut. I wanted to reach out, to tell her that I hadn't done this to hurt her, but I knew it wouldn't matter. She had to find her own way through this, and I couldn't force her to see things from my perspective. All I could do was wait. Weeks passed, and the investigation continued to unfold. Elliot's legal team scrambled to protect him, but the evidence was overwhelming. The charges piled up, and the prospect of a trial loomed over the Montgomery family like a dark cloud. Adeline, once so poised and graceful, had disappeared from the public eye, retreating into the shadows of the scandal. The family's empire was crumbling, and there was no way to stop it. I thought about Caroline every day. I wondered where she was, how she was doing. Had she found a way to cope with everything? Was she rebuilding her life without the weight of her family's lies? I wanted to believe that she was okay, that she was stronger than the devastation that had engulfed her. But part of me feared that she was lost, that she wouldn't be able to find her way out of the darkness. One day, while I was sitting in my apartment, staring blankly at the news reports on TV, my phone buzzed. I glanced down, not expecting much, but when I saw the name on the screen, my heart skipped a beat. Caroline. For a moment, I just stared at the phone, not sure if I should answer. What if she didn't want to talk? What if she was calling to tell me that she never wanted to see me again? But before I could think too much about it, I swiped to answer. Caroline, I said, my voice shaky. There was a pause on the other end, and for a moment, I thought she might have hung up. But then, her voice came through, soft but steady. Leo. I closed my eyes, relief flooding through me. Caroline, I didn't know if I'd ever hear from you. I've been thinking, she said, her tone careful, about everything. About us, about what happened. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. I'm so sorry, Caroline. I never wanted to hurt you. I only wanted to protect you from the lies your father was hiding. I had to tell you the truth. I know, she said, her voice quieter now. And I'm not calling to blame you. I've had time to think about it, to process everything. What you did, it was right. As much as it hurts, as much as I hate what's happened, I know you did the right thing. Hearing her say those words felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders, but there was still a heaviness in her voice that I couldn't ignore. But it doesn't change how I feel, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I need time, Leo. I need to figure out who I am without all of this, without my family, without the lies, without everything. I don't know what that looks like yet, and I don't know what that means for us. My chest tightened, but I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I understand. Take all the time you need. I'll be here, whenever you're ready. Another pause, and I could hear her breathing softly on the other end. Thank you, Leo, for everything. For the truth, for being there, for caring. I don't know when, or if, I'll be ready. Tears stung my eyes, but I forced a smile, hoping she could hear the sincerity in my voice. I'll wait, as long as it takes. There was a long silence after that, and then finally she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. Goodbye, Leo. Goodbye, Caroline, I whispered back, my heart aching as the line went dead. I sat there for a long time after the call ended, the phone still in my hand. Caroline's words echoed in my mind, and for the first time, I truly understood the depth of what had happened. I had exposed the truth, but in doing so, I had lost the person I loved. She needed time, space to rebuild herself, and I couldn't force my way back into her life. I had to let her go, even if it meant that I might never see her again. The investigation into Elliot continued, and eventually the case went to trial. The Montgomery Empire was in ruins, and Elliot's fate was sealed by the mountains of evidence against him. It was the end of an era, the end of the legacy he had built on deception and greed. But it wasn't the end of the story. For Caroline, for me, the story was just beginning, one built on truth, even if it was painful. And as much as I wished things could have been different, I knew that sometimes the hardest choices were the ones that set us free.